The Duke of Aldermere was standing at the tall window of the counting room, with the Lord Chamberlain's letter open in his hand, when she asked him for 5 minutes on the subject of his own porcelain. And he did not give her the 5 minutes. He gave her the glance a tired man gives a piece of furniture that has unaccountably spoken. And then he turned to the London connoisseur at his elbow, Mr. Lucian Pym, a slender, scented gentleman in a plum-colored coat who had come down from town to pronounce upon the works and was warming his hands at the fire as though the fire had been laid for his particular comfort, and he said it to Pym and not to her. "Leave the Glazes to London men, if you please." And Pym gave the soft, indulgent smile of a man being agreed with. And Honora Vale stood in the middle of the counting-room floor with a small painted tea-bowl wrapped in a linen handkerchief cupped in both her hands like a bird that might yet fly, and understood that the interview was over before it had begun. She made her curtsy, because a paintress at a ducal manufactory curtsies to the duke who owns it, and she went out past the superintendent, Mr. Ezra Threlfall, who held the door for her with beautiful manners and eyes like a locked ledger, and she walked back across the wet yard to the painting room under the north light, and the long, low ranges of the Aldermere porcelain works stood on either side of her the whole way. The throwing sheds and the slip houses and the great bottle kilns rising into the January dusk, 3 of them cold that should have been firing, and the smoke of the 4th going up thin and starved into a sky the color of ash. And she knew, as few on that ground knew, that not one of those kilns was cold, because the clay had failed, or the art had died, whatever the London gentleman's verdict might say. That was January, in the year 1817, with half the pot banks of England undercut by cheaper wares, and the Aldermere works 2 bad quarters from the auctioneer's hammer. And it is worth telling you now, before we go back and take the whole of it in order, that on 12th night of that same winter, the 6th of January, in the great glazing house with the Prince Regent's own commissioner standing by, and half the county craning at the doors, that same duke would strip off his fine coat and roll back his shirt sleeve and reach with his own bare hands into the cooling mouth of a drawn kiln, and lift out of the straw and the ash a single covered cup the deep living blue of a summer midnight, a blue no other manufactory in the kingdom could make, and the whole trade had sworn was lost, and that he would hold it up into the lamplight with his own fingers, sound and true, and singing under the thumb like a bell, out of a works his hired experts had certified in writing, was finished and fit only to be sold for the price of its sheds, and that he would stand there a long moment with the cup on his open palm, not because he did not understand what it meant, but because he understood everything it meant, about his manufactory, and his superintendent, and the scented man in the plum-colored coat, and the young woman he had not given 5 minutes to in January. But that was 12th night, and this was the first week of the year, and between the 2 of them lies the whole of this story. She was 25 that winter, and she had been born, you might say, in the works themselves, for her father, Josiah Vale, had been 36 years at Aldermere, and had ended master colorist and enameler, the man the old duke sent for, when a question of glaze or ground or firing could not be answered out of the ordinary way of the trade. Josiah Vale had no son, and he had a daughter who followed him from the time she could walk, through the slip houses and the biscuit kilns and the grinding room and the little sanctum under the north window where the colors were mixed, and he was a man who could no more keep knowledge to himself than a kiln can keep its heat, and so, without either of them ever once calling it teaching, he taught her. He taught her that porcelain is a lie the fire either forgives or does not, that a thing goes into the kiln one color and one size and comes out another, and that the whole art of it is knowing before ever you close the wicket and light the first fire, what the flame will do to what your hands have made. He taught her the bodies and the pastes, the china stone and the china clay, and the calcined bone, the proportions that come out of the fire white and translucent as a fingernail held to a candle. And above all he taught her color, which was his own particular kingdom, the metal oxides that go into the fire one drab powder and come out a garden, and the one that was his masterpiece and his secret, the deep cobalt blue the trade round about had come to call veil blue, a blue with no purple in it and no gray, a blue like the last of the sky before full dark, which he made by a grinding and a washing and a mixing of the raw ore that he had worked out across 20 years and had never written plainly down, because a secret written plainly down is a secret sold. She could grind a color at 10 years old, and by 17 she could mix her father's blue by eye and hand alone and bring it true out of the fire 9 firings in 10, and none of it was worth a shilling to her as a station in life, because the manufactory did not make women master colorists, and the world had no shelf on which such a knowledge in such a keeping could be set. Then, inside a single hard year, the whole of it came down. The old Duke died, who had valued Josiah Vale and protected him, and Josiah himself, never strong in the chest after 40 years of breathing the flint dust and the color fume, took a congestion of the lungs in the wet autumn, and was 3 weeks dying. And at the end of it, fevered and laboring for every breath, he did the thing he had always meant to do in some safe, unhurried season that never came. He tried to set down his secret for his daughter, and got no further than a few coded lines in the little marbled memorandum book he kept. A column of numbers and a few words in a private shorthand of his own, before the strength went out of his hand, and he died with the whole of the true making of Vale Blue where it had always lived, which was in his head, and in one other place on earth that nobody but the two of them knew of, and we shall come to that. And Honora Vale, 24, with a head full of her father's kingdom and no honest station from which to rule any part of it, discovered what the daughters of dead craftsmen discover, that she was fit in the world's eyes for exactly one respectable employment about a great house, and so she stayed on at Aldermere, not as her father's heir, but as a paintress in the flower room, and, when the old duchess's companion fell ill, as a reader and a fetcher of shawls in the great house besides, a young woman of the works who had once, the older hands would tell you low, done things with a color that nobody left living could do now. The Duke of Aldermere was 31 that winter, and he had been Duke for 2 years, and the truth of his situation, which the county guessed in outline and he knew to the last grinding figure, was this: his father had been a warm, headlong man who had loved the manufactory for the pride and the beauty of it and never for the profit, had poured into it more than it ever gave back, and had died leaving the estate mortgaged and the works running at a loss that only the estate had been propping up. And the young Duke had spent 2 years learning the cold arithmetic of a great inheritance going down, and had come to the plain edge of it, which was that the manufactory must within the year either pay its own way or be sold. And into that plain edge, like a single door in a blank wall, had come the one deliverance a struggling porcelain works could pray for and almost never get: the Prince Regent, refurbishing his houses in the grand new taste and minded to bestow his custom on an English manufactory to spite the French, had let it be known through the Lord Chamberlain's office that he would commission a great table, service, several hundred pieces of the very first quality, and would grant to the works that supplied it his royal warrant and the right to call themselves porcelain makers to his Royal Highness, a commission worth, over the years of its making and the custom a warrant draws behind it, upwards of 35,000 pounds. Enough to clear the works of debt and set the whole of Aldermere on honest ground for a generation. But the regent's household did not buy porcelain unseen, and so there was to be a judging. 3 manufactories had been named as worthy to compete, each to submit before Twelfth Night a garniture of its finest ware to be examined at Carlton House by the regent's own porcelain commissioner, a Mr. Alderson, a hard-fare man who had bought china for 2 royal households and could not be flattered, and the warrant would go to the best only. And here the trap in the thing closes. Because the regent's people, knowing little themselves of the mysteries of the pot bank, had asked a fashionable authority to advise them which of the 3 English works was truly capable of the first quality. A gentleman whose taste ruled the drawing rooms, and whose word could make or unmake a manufactory in a season. Mr. Lucian Pym and Mr. Lucian Pym had come down to Aldermere in the first week of January, walked the works for 2 days with his scented handkerchief to his nose, examined the ware that the kilns had lately and disastrously been turning out, and delivered his judgment, and his judgment was a sentence of death. "The Aldermere works," said Pym, in the beautiful languid manner of a man pronouncing upon a dish at his own table, had been in its day a pretty enough provincial pot bank, but its day was plainly done. The recent firings were coarse and clouded, the whites gone gray, the once famous blue now muddy, uneven, and dead, running from the shape or blistering in the fire. The body itself he thought no longer sound. The works, in short, was decayed past any hope of the first quality, and His Royal Highness's commissioner would be advised, with regret, to strike Aldermere from the list and consider the 2 remaining manufactories, of which the more promising, said Pym, was the Staffordshire house of a Mr. Cottrell, at Burslem, whose recent wares had come on so wonderfully, a manufactory that had made for 60 years the finest colored porcelain in the Midland counties was, by the drawl of a fashionable gentleman, worth not a royal warrant and £35,000 but the breaking price of its buildings, and the Duke, who could not read the inside of a firing and had never needed to, because reading the inside of firings was what one paid a superintendent and a colorist to do, took the verdict the way a man takes a diagnosis out of a great physician's mouth, with horror and with belief. It never once occurred to him to doubt it. It is the whole hinge of this story that it never once occurred to him to doubt it, and we shall stop on that hinge presently. But first you must see what came up from Burslem 8 days behind the verdict, because the timing is the confession, if anyone in that anxious house had been cold enough to read it. What came was an offer. Mr. Silas Cottrell, of Burslem in the county of Stafford, master potter, a person the Duke had never met, wrote most respectfully to say that he had heard, as men in the trade hear things, of His Grace's disappointment, that a failing manufactory was a wasting thing to keep, that out of respect for the ancient house of Aldermere he would take the works entire as they stood, kilns and sheds and clay wrights and the goodwill of the name, at £4,000, money down, and Mr. Ezra Threlfall, the superintendent, carrying the letter to his master, observed gravely that it was a bitter thing, but that £4,000 of ready money was £4,000, that the mortgages would not wait upon sentiment, and that a dying works, like any other dying thing, did not mend by being kept. Now it is worth stopping, as I promised, on the hinge, on why a clever and by no means trusting man believed the verdict with his whole heart. When a house is struck by a thing it cannot read, a lawsuit, a disease, a debt, a failing manufactory, it does not send for the truth, it sends for the one man who says, calmly, I understand this, leave it with me. And whatever that man then says becomes, for the stricken house, not an opinion, but the weather. Mr. Pym was the arbiter the regent's own household had trusted, the first taste in England, and behind Pym, nearer and quieter, stood Mr. Ezra Threlfall, who had been superintendent at Aldermere for 5 years, who had come to the old Duke with excellent testimonials out of a great works in the north, and who had made himself, through the long decline, the one channel through which every difficult thing about the manufactory passed: the accounts, the wages, the orders, the very firing book of the kilns, until the young Duke, who trusted no man on principle, trusted Threlfall by exhaustion, which is the way most trust is actually built. And if any man had thought to lay the last 2 years of failing firings end to end and ask why the great blue, which had never failed in Josiah Vale's 40 years, had begun to fail within a season of his death and had gone on failing steadily ever since, no man did, because the superintendent kept the firing book. And the firing book told a sorrowful, consistent, wholly convincing story of a works whose master secret had died with its master and could not be got back. What Honora Vale knew of all this, that January, was at first only what a young woman of the works knows, which is everything and nothing: the shape of trouble through the sheds, the older hands falling quiet when she passed, the little pug boys asking her why 3 kilns stood cold. But what Honora Vale knew that no other living soul on that ground knew, she knew because her father had put it into her hands. And it was this: that the making of Vale blue had not died with Josiah Vale, because Josiah Vale had taught it, whole and entire, to his daughter, at the grinding slab under the north window across the 20 years of her growing up. And that the story of a lost secret was therefore, on its face, a lie. She could make the blue. She had made it in small, for her own heart's easing, twice since her father's death, on the sly, in a corner of the enamel kiln when the firemen were at their dinner, and it had come out of the little muffle as true and deep and living as ever it came for him. So when the word ran through the sheds that the London gentleman had found the works decayed, and the famous blue, dead past recovery, Honora Vale stood at her painting bench under the cold north light and did not think, how dreadful, the way the house thought it. She thought, in her father's flat, level, color-room voice, that is not true. And she was as certain of it as she was of her own name, and her certainty was worth exactly nothing, because it lived in the head of a paintress, and the falsehood lived in the mouth of the first arbiter of taste in England and in the firing book of the works itself. She did not go to the Duke that first week. She went to the kilns. Not openly, a paintress has no business at the great kilns, and she had begun, without yet putting the reason into words, to feel that being seen too curious about the failing firings was a dangerous thing at Aldermere just then. But quietly, at the edges of the day, reading the works as her father had taught her to read a firing after the fact, from the ware itself and the ash and the placing of the saggers, and by the end of a fortnight she had found the thing that turned her cold certainty colder, because it turned a lost secret into something no accident could be. The blue was not failing. The blue was being murdered. Firing after ruined firing, she gathered the spoiled pieces the packers threw into the shard ruck, and she read them the way her father had taught her to read a fault, and the faults would not lie down into the story the firing book told. Muddy, blistered, run, yes, but not with the fault of a lost recipe which is a color weak and thin and true as far as it goes. These were the faults of a good color deliberately mishandled, ground too coarse where her father ground fine, laid on over a ground fired wrong, and above all set into the kiln in the cool killing places near the wicket and the crown, where any fireman of 10 years standing knew the great blue would never bear to stand, while the safe true heart of the kiln, where the blue would have come out singing, was packed those firings with plain white ware and slop. It was not incompetence. Incompetence scatters its faults. This was fault with an architecture. Somebody who knew the kilns to the brick was spoiling the great blue on purpose, firing after firing, so that the works should appear to have lost the one thing that made it worth the saving. And there was only one man at Aldermere who ordered the packing of the kilns and kept the firing book and stood to gain by the ruin. And 8 days after the London gentleman certified the works dead, a letter had come up from Burslem offering £4,000 for a manufactory that a royal warrant would have made worth 10 times as much. It took a fashionable arbiter to say the words in the drawing rooms of the great. It took somebody inside the gate to make the words come true in the fire, to know the mortgages to the month, to spoil the firings by an art, to stand at a grieving man's elbow and murmur that a dying works does not mend by keeping. She could not yet prove the second man. But she had grown up in a manufactory, where the frauds are as old as the trade, and she knew the shape of this one the way a gamekeeper knows a snare, sink the value of the thing by a secret hand, buy the thing cheap through a friend, sell the friend the secret after. For she did not doubt for a moment that once Cottrell of Burslem had the works and the sheds and the name, he would find, marvelously, that the great blue could be made again after all. So she wrapped the little true blue tea-bowl she had fired on the sly in her clean handkerchief, and she asked, properly, through the housekeeper, for 5 minutes of his Grace's time upon the subject of the works. And she stood in the counting room in her grey stuff gown, with 20 years of the color room in her head, and the living proof of the murdered blue cupped in her 2 hands. And the Duke of Aldermere, who had that morning received Cottrell's letter and Threlfall's gentle advice to close with it, looked at a paintress from the flower room, proposing to overturn the certified judgment of the first taste in England, and said the sentence to Pym's Warmback that this story is named for, and Pym smiled, and she made her curtsy and carried her handkerchief and the proof inside it back out across the wet yard. And here again it is worth being fair to the man at the window, because this story is not about a stupid duke, it is about the machinery of believing, which catches clever men by preference. He was 31, and drowning, and ashamed of drowning. He had spent 2 years learning that hope at Aldermere was a tax paid to disappointment. The London verdict had cost him his last deliverance, and he had, with a hard discipline that was the best thing in him, made himself accept it in a week. Because a man bailing a sinking house cannot afford to court false hope, and here was false hope walking into his counting room in a grey gown, carrying, of all things on earth, a teacup. To believe her, he would have had to believe that the arbiter the regent trusted was a fool or a knave, that the superintendent who had held his arm through every trouble was a saboteur, and that the one person in the county who could see it was the young woman who painted flowers on his biscuit ware and read to his mother of an evening, and disbelieving her cost nothing but a sentence, while believing her cost the whole architecture of the only trust that was keeping him upright. So he spent the sentence. Men mostly do. And Mr. Ezra Threlfall, who had held the door for her with his ledger eyes, walked back into the counting room and heard from the connoisseur, in the comfortable tones of a joke shared between men of the world, what the paintress had come about, and Threlfall laughed the proper amount, and said something easy about clever young women with notions above the flower room, and behind the smooth front of his face he began, with great method, to be afraid. Because Threlfall had made in 5 years exactly one mistake, the mistake careful men make, he had reckoned every danger to his scheme that could keep an account or sign a letter, and it had never once occurred to him that the danger might wear a paintress's apron and carry, alone in the whole of England, the very secret he had spent 2 years pretending was dead. What Honora did next She did because her father had drummed it into her at the grinding slab when she was 12 years old and sulking over a color she had mixed true and a foreman had waved away. That being right, he told her, is the cheap half of the work. The dear half is making your rightness stand up on its own legs, in a room where you are not, in front of men who would rather it fell down. And the only bridge from the cheap half to the dear half in the pot trade is the fired proof. For the fire cannot be argued with and cannot be flattered and does not care whose daughter you are. So she resolved to make the proof, and the proof could be only one thing. She must, in secret, against the whole certified opinion of the works and the trade, fire a garniture of aldermere ware in the true old blue so perfect that a hard fair man standing before it could not call it decayed without calling the sun dark, and she must do it in time to set it, somehow before the regent's commissioner by 12th night. She could not do it alone, and she did not have to, because the works had one other keeper of the old faith, and he had been grieving as hard as she had been reading shards. Ned Fairclough had been a fireman at Aldermere for 42 years. As his father had fired the kilns before him, he was 80 years and 8, built like the fire mouths he tended, and he had loved Josiah Vale as a younger brother loves an elder, and he had stood by, this last 2 years, watching the great blue murdered firing after firing under orders he was made to obey, and could not read the wickedness of until his heart was ash, and when he had ventured once to say to the superintendent that in 42 years he had never known the blue set so near the crown of the kiln, where no blue would live. Mr. Threlfall had explained to him kindly that the ways were changed now, and the old fireman's fancies were not science. And Ned had gone home to his cottage and not spoken for a day. Honora found him banking the dying enamel kiln one evening at dusk, and she did not offer the old man comfort. She offered him the one thing left on earth he could use, which was the truth, and a hand in setting it right. She unwrapped her handkerchief on the bench in the lamplight, and set before him the little tea-bowl she had fired on the sly, the true Vale blue living in the glaze deep as a well. And Ned Fairclough looked at a color he had been told for 2 years was dead forever, made new by Josiah Vale's daughter in a corner of his own kiln, with his mouth slowly opening, and at the end of it he took off his hat, which he had kept on for dukes, and he said that the Lord had not taken all of Josiah after all. And what did she need? What she needed was his 42 years, and his key to the little disused pug mill kiln at the far dark end of the works, cold these 10 years, where a fire might be lit that the superintendent's eye would not fall on. And she needed his silence, and his old fireman's cunning at the wicket, and his knowledge of when Threlfall was from home. And through the iron heart of that January, in stolen hours, in the cold and the dark and the flint dust, the two of them set about doing in secret the thing the whole works had been paid to swear could no longer be done. She mixed the color with her own hands the way her father had taught her. She painted. On white biscuit, she and Ned smuggled out of the store the old Aldermere patterns her father had loved, the border of oak leaves and the running spray of convolvulus, in the deep living blue, and Ned Fairclough fired them for her in the little kiln in the true old way. The blue set in the sweet heart of the fire where it would bear, and firing by firing, out of the cooling mouth of a kiln 10 years cold, there came into her hands the proof, white as a fingernail against the candle, and blue as the last of the sky, where such as had not come whole out of Aldermere since Josiah Vale went into the ground. The very first quality. The thing the London gentleman had sworn upon his taste was decayed past hope. And while the ware grew, she built the other proof beside it, the proof for a different sort of court, Because a beautiful cup proves the works can make beauty, but it does not by itself prove that a man murdered the firings and sold his master to Burslem. And this she got the oldest way there is, by the memory and the loyalty of working men. For the fault was in the firing book, and the firing book was Threlfall's. But the kilns had been fired by men, and the men remembered, which firings the great blue had been ordered set high and cold against all custom, and by whose written direction, and the pug boy who had carried more than once a sealed packet from the superintendent's office to the Burslem carrier, booked in the office day book in Threlfall's own hand, and directed to Mr. Silas Cottrell, the earliest of them dated in October, 11 weeks before the London verdict that Cottrell's letter would claim to have heard of only by the common talk of the trade. And one bright particular thing, that Ned Fairclough himself had once seen spread on Threlfall's desk under the lamp a Burslem memorandum of agreement, with the superintendent's name to it and a sum, and had made out the 2 words continued employment before Threlfall covered it with his arm. Out of such small remembered things, gathered from men who had loved Josiah Vale and been shamed into silence, set down fair in Honora's steady hand with the marks and crosses of those who could not sign, the second proof assembled itself into a plain question no honest man could read without wanting it answered. How did the buyer of a ruined works come to be corresponding with the works' own superintendent a full season before the works was ruined? While the 2 proofs grew, the house grew colder around her, because Threlfall was not a man to wait upon events. He could not get at what she was making, for he did not know the little dead kiln had a fire in it, nor that a paintress could raise the ghost of Vale Blue. But he could smell method in her new gravity and her early risings and her closeness with the old fireman, and he went for the person. Because a young woman's good name is a cheap thing to break, and a clever young woman's cheaper still. It began as weather, the way it always begins. A word here that the paintress Vale was grown strange since her father's death, and much alone at odd hours about the works. A graver word to the housekeeper that young females who had followed a man's trade too close sometimes suffered in their wits, and wanted watching. A regretful murmur at the Duke's very elbow that the Vale girl had got a fixed notion that the works could be saved, and was to be pitied, and perhaps, gently, moved on before the fancy grew. And none of it was ever said as an accusation, only ever as a concern, which is the assassin's grammar. And Honora felt the ground go soft under her 1 plank at a time. The housekeeper's new coolness, the older women's careful eyes, a hint from the steward's wife that the great house would not perhaps require her reading through the spring, and understood that she was in a race now, her fire against his whisper, and that the whisper was faster. So she reached for the one weight she knew of in England heavy enough to anchor her side of the scale, and it cost her the hardest evening of the winter, because the reaching meant asking, and she had her father's pride in her throat like a swallowed coal. She sat down in the cold painting room on the 2nd Sunday of the year and wrote to London, to Dr. Emery Wexcombe, of the Royal Institution, a chemist of great name who had years before come to Aldermere to study the making of the colors and had spent 3 days at Josiah Vale's grinding slab and gone away calling him, before the whole works, the finest natural chemist he had met outside the institution's own walls. And she did not write him a plea, because a plea runs off a man of science like water off a glaze. She wrote him an account. 12 close pages, the works, the verdict, the failing firings and the true fault in them, the secret of the blue that had not died but been suppressed, the little kiln and the proof coming out of it, the Burslem packets and the October date, and the memorandum under the lamp, and the judging at Carlton House and the closing of it upon 12th night, all of it in the dry, particular language of the trade he had once troubled to learn. And at the foot of the last page she permitted herself 3 sentences that were not account at all. You knew my father, sir, and you told him before the whole works that his eye and his hand were worth an institution to themselves. If I am wrong about the blue, come and shame me in an afternoon at the little kiln, and I will bear it. But if I am right, then the finest colored porcelain in England is being murdered by a hired hand to be stolen for the price of its bricks, and a good man robbed with it, and I am one paintress with a secret nobody will take from my mouth, and Twelfth night is the 6th of January. Dr. Wexcombe received that letter on a Wednesday. He read it twice at his desk with the noise of the institution about him, and the young men who worked under him remarked that afternoon that the doctor was short, which was rare, and on the Friday, having laid his lectures on his deputy and his warmest coat in a valise, he took the mail, 62 years old, unannounced, at his own charge, 130 miles into the Midland winter, because Josiah Vale's daughter had sent him 12 pages that either proved a great fraud and the survival of a lost art, or proved nothing. And there was one way on earth to know which, and it stood cooling in a little kiln at the dark end of the Aldermere Works. And there was one evening in the middle of that cold fortnight that she never afterward told anybody about except, years later, her daughter, and I will tell it to you because it is the truest thing in the story. It was the evening she nearly stopped. The word had come that morning, kindly, that the great house would not need her reading after Lady Day. The housekeeper had asked her, with terrible gentleness, whether she was sleeping, in the voice one uses to the possibly mad, and one of the flower-room girls, who had been her friend, had drawn her skirts aside from Honora's bench, as from something that might be catching. And that evening she sat in the little disused kiln house, with the last drawn pieces cooling on the straw before her, the true blue coming up in them as the heat went out, and she looked at them and thought, clearly and coldly, the way her father had taught her to think, nobody has asked me to do this. The works are not mine. The Duke is not mine. If Aldermere is sold to Burslem and the great blue with it, no living soul will ever reproach me, and if I go on, I stand to lose the only place and character and roof I have, for the privilege of being called mad by a county that will never know what the word cost me. And the door out of all of it stands open, and is called silence, and silence is respectable, and silence is safe, and silence is warm. She sat with that door open a long time, the blue deepening in the cooling cups like the dusk coming down. And what shut it in the end was not courage, and she always said so. It was the plain color room fact her father had ground into her before she was 10, standing among the drying ware, that a secret is not a possession but a trust, that a knowledge given into your hands by a dying man is a lamp handed to you in the dark with the one instruction, do not let it go out, and that a truth you alone can tell, and do not tell, does not stay quietly untold. It goes out of the world, and takes with it everything and every one it might have saved, and you are the one who let it go. She had been given the only surviving key to a locked room full of light, and she could open it or she could sit in the warm dark holding the key till she died. And there was, when she thought of her father's hands teaching hers at the slab, no choosing between the two. She wiped her eyes, and she banked the little fire against the morning, and she set the cooled blue cups in their straw in the hamper, one by one. And the door called silence swung shut behind her and never opened again. Dr. Wexcombe came to the little kiln house, not the great house, because he was a methodical man and would not stand in a duke's hall on a paintress's word until he had made the thing his own. and for the better part of 2 days. With Honora stealing hours and old Ned Fairclough keeping the door, the chemist of the Royal Institution tested the proof. He tested it the way she had prayed he would, which is to say, against her, he would not take her word that the ware was hers or new, but had her mix a color before his eyes from the raw ore, and grind it, and lay it, and had Ned fire it in his sight in the little kiln, and drew it himself with his own gloved hand when it was cool, and when the cup came out of the straw the deep living blue of every promise she had made him. Doctor, Emery Wexcombe held it up to the winter window a long time, turning it in the gray light, and said, quietly, to nobody in particular, 35 years I have studied the colors of the fire, and there are 3 men in Europe I would have said could make that blue, and all 3 are dead, and one of them is your father. And then he turned to Honora Vale and said the thing she carried afterward all her life. They told the Prince Regent's man that this art was lost, and it was not lost. It was standing in an apron in a cold shed, making it for her own grief. Now, child, let us go and trouble your duke. Getting a paintress, an old fireman, and a chemist of the Royal Institution into a duke's presence unannounced ought to have been the hardest fence in the whole business, and it proved the easiest, because reputation opens its own doors. Dr. Wexcombe sent up his card of the Royal Institution upon a matter touching His Royal Highness's commission, and no steward in England could keep that card from a duke with a royal warrant slipping through his fingers, and Twelfth, who was in the counting room when it came, could not prevent the sending of it up, though he contrived to be present. Standing at his master's shoulder with his ledger eyes, when the 3 of them came in, the old fireman with his hat in his hands, the square gray man of science with a covered hamper, and behind them the paintress he had spent a sentence on in January. And Honora watched the duke's face as he took them in, and she saw the sequence cross it plainly. Surprise, then irritation, then, as understanding began to arrive, something that was neither, something wary and young and almost like hunger, the look of a man who hears, against every discipline he has taught himself, the word hope come back into a room he had cleared of it. Dr. Wexcombe did not orate. He set his credentials on the table, and he said that he had these 2 days past examined, at his own charge and upon information received, the state of the color art at the Aldermere Works, that it was his professional judgment that the great blue for which the works was famous was not lost, not decayed, and not dead, but living and perfect, and being made upon the very ground, and that the recent failure of it in the kilns was not the work of nature, but of a hand, that both of these things were provable within the hour by any man with eyes, and that as the matter touched His Royal Highness's commission and the honor of an English manufactory, His Grace would understand that it had ceased to be a private disappointment and become a public one. And then, into the Duke's dead silence, he said, "But your Grace should not take my word either, for my word is only the paintress's word in a black coat, and the whole sickness of this business from the first has been that clever men have taken some other man's word for what stands written plainly in the fired clay, which cannot lie. There is a fair test. Let your Grace set it himself." And he lifted the cloth from the hamper, and set upon the counting-room table, one by one, in the gray January light, a dozen pieces of Aldermere porcelain, white as a candled fingernail and blue as midnight, the oak leaf border and the running convolvulus, such ware as had not been seen new in that room in 2 years. And the Duke of Aldermere, who had been told by the first taste in England that his works could no longer make such a thing, put out his hand and touched the rim of a cup as a man touches something he is afraid will prove a dream, and did not speak. And Mr. Ezra Threlfall, at his master's shoulder, looked at a dozen pieces of a color he had spent 2 years and a great wickedness persuading the world was dead. And the smooth front of his face held, because he was a strong man in his way. But Honora, watching him as her father had taught her to watch a cooling kiln for the first hair crack, saw the thing move once behind his eyes and knew that he had understood, in that instant, that he was a ruined man and was already behind the steady face, casting up like the practiced clerk. He was the account of what might yet be saved. What the Duke set, on Dr. Wexcombe's urging, was the only test that could settle it past all talk, and it was to be a public one, because a proof no man of weight witnesses is a proof that never happened. 3 days before 12th night, in the great glazing house of the works, before witnesses of standing, the rector, the family's man of law, Dr. Wexcombe of the Royal Institution, and, sent for by an express, the Duke signed himself with his jaw set, the Regent's own commissioner, Miss Alderson, breaking his journey to Carlton House to see with his own eyes a thing he had been told could not be. A fresh garniture would be made from the raw materials of the works, by the work's own hands and none other, and fired in the work's own great kiln and drawn before them all. And if the great blue came out of that fire the first quality, then the London gentleman's verdict was a lie, and the works lived, and the Duke would know past doubting whose art had made it, and whose hand had murdered it these 2 years. And Mr. Lucian Pym, sent for likewise and arriving in his plum-colored coat, believing he came down to smooth away a provincial misunderstanding, found the misunderstanding wearing the black coat of a chemist of the Royal Institution, whom he knew by reputation and could not condescend to, and the commissioner of the Regent's own household standing grave beside the kiln, and understood, too late, that he had staked the whole of his fashionable authority upon a verdict that was about to be drawn out of a fire in front of him. The making of it fell across those 3 days like a held breath. Honora Vale mixed the blue with her own hands before the witnesses' eyes, from the raw ore of the works, ground and washed and proportioned, by no receipt any man could see, for it lived nowhere but in her. She painted the pieces at a bench set up in the glazing house, so that no man could say the ware had been got from elsewhere. The Duke himself, at Dr. Wexcombe's word, this was the thing that turned it. Teach the man's own hands, and the head will follow. Took up a brush under her quiet direction and laid, clumsily and then less clumsily, a single blue oak leaf upon the rim of one cup, so that there should be in the trial one piece the Duke of Aldermary had painted with his own hand and could never afterward pretend he had not seen made. And old Ned Fairclough, 42 years a fireman, set the kiln, the great blue in the sweet true heart of the fire, where it would bear, where for 2 years it had been forbidden to stand, and banked it, and watched it through the nights with the Duke himself sitting up beside him more than once in the red glow, learning the fire he had never troubled to understand while he still owned it. And on the morning of the 4th of January, the 3rd day, with the frost bright on the glazing house roof, and the company gathered, the commissioner grave, the rector anxious, the lawyer watchful, Pym very still, Threlfall superbly composed and attending upon his master as though nothing on earth were the matter, the wicket was broken, and the drawing began. It was done in a silence like church. The saggers came out one by one on the long iron peels, and were opened, and the ware lifted into the winter light, and piece after piece came up out of the straw, and the ash white and true and blue as the last of the sky. The oak leaf border unbroken, the convolvulus running clean, the whole garniture the first quality, and past all cavil the first quality, ware to set on a king's table. And last of all, the covered cup the Duke himself had touched with a brush, and Dr. Wexcombe lifted it, and set it into the Duke of Aldermere's own hands. And the Duke turned it in his fingers before them all, his own blue oak leaf living in the glaze, sound and singing under the thumb, out of a works his hired arbiter had certified was fit only to be sold for its sheds. And the Duke of Aldermere stood there a long moment with the cup on his open palm. And what was in his face was the thing Honora had seen begin in the counting room, arrived now whole, a man to whom the inside of a thing had at last been shown, holding the proof in his own two hands, past all need of being told by anybody what anything meant ever again. Mr. Lucian Pym did what men of his kind do at the cliff edge, which is to talk of the accidents of a single lucky firing, of the difference between a piece and a manufactory, his beautiful voice as smooth as ever but quicker, a fatal shade quicker. And Dr. Wexcombe let him talk himself to the end of it, and then said only, "This is not one lucky firing, sir. It is the raw ore of this works made into the first quality before 4 witnesses in 3 days, and either you knew this works could do it, in which case your verdict was a lie, or you did not know, in which case you are no judge. There is no third thing." And then the old fireman, Ned Fairclough, who had held his peace 2 years, put down before the commissioner the firing book, which Honora had got the loan of by a stratagem for one night, and laid beside it his own plain testimony and the crosses of the other firemen, and said, in the flat voice of a man who has waited a long while to say a true thing, "The blue never failed, sir, in Josiah Vale's 40 years, nor in mine, till it was ordered set where it could not live. And here is whose order it was, in his own hand, and beside it, for a different court, the matter of the packets to Burslem, booked in the superintendent's writing, the first of them dated in October, 11 weeks before the London gentleman ever set foot in the county to find the works decayed." In the silence after that, every face in the glazing house turned to Mr. Ezra Threlfall, and Honora, watching him from the edge of the company in her grey gown, entirely still, saw the smooth front hold for 3 full seconds, and saw the clerk behind it finish his casting up and reach for the only entry left, and then Ezra Threlfall did the cold thing, the clever thing, the thing his kind always does. He expressed himself thunderstruck. He said that he had trusted the London gentleman's judgment as his master had, having no art to question it, that the setting of the kilns had been done by the firemen, and if error had crept in it, was theirs, that the packets to Burslem had contained ordinary trade correspondence upon the matter of clay rights he would gladly lay before the lawyers, that he welcomed, none more, warmly, the fullest inquiry, and he made his master a small correct bow, and it was beautifully done, seamless, unhurried, and it broke, for the first time in 5 years, against something it had never yet met in that house, which was a man who had stopped taking anybody's word for the inside of anything. The Duke of Aldermere looked at his superintendent a long moment, and then he said, quite quietly, in front of them all, "Mr. Threlfall, you advised me a fortnight since to sell to Burslem, because a dying works does not mend by keeping. You will render your books to my lawyer by Friday, and you will not sleep under my roof tonight." And then he turned his back on the man, which in that place and that company was the whole of the sentence, and looked across the glazing house, past the commissioner and the rector, to the paintress standing grey and still at the edge of the light, and in front of them all he said the other thing, the thing that cost him more, Miss Vale. In January I asked a question of this room, and did not stay for the answer. I am told the answer has been making itself in a cold kiln at the end of my own works, in your 2 hands, since before I knew there was a question. I should be glad, if you will permit it, to be taught to read it. There remained the race, because a fraud broken in a glazing house is not a warrant granted at Carlton House, and Twelfth Night stood 2 days off, and the regent's judging would close upon it whether the truth reached London in time or sat weather bound on a road. But the hardest part was already won, because the man who had come to judge was standing in the glazing house when the kiln was drawn. Mr. Alderson, the commissioner, was a hard, fair man who had bought porcelain for 2 royal households and been lied to by experts all his life, and he had watched a dozen pieces of the first quality come out of the raw ore of a works he had been told was dead. And he was not a man who needed the thing explained to him twice. He took with him to Carlton House the garniture drawn that morning, and the Duke's own blue-leaved cup, and a plain letter under Dr. Wexcombe's hand and his own report, and on Twelfth Night itself, the 6th of January, before the Lord Chamberlain's people in the great rooms at Carlton House, the ware of Aldermere was set against the ware of the 2 rival houses, and there was, the commissioner said afterward, in truth, no contest once the blue was on the table, for the one thing the regent had asked for was a service the like of which no French manufactory could show, and here was a blue no manufactory in Europe could match. And the royal warrant, and the commission for the great service, several hundred pieces of the first quality, worth over the years of its making, and the custom that follows a warrant upward of £35,000, was granted that 12th night to the Aldermere works, and that is the plain sum of what a paintress with a secret in her head was worth to the house that had given her a sentence and a shut door in January. Justice, which is never as tidy in the record as in the telling, fell out this way. Mr. Lucian Pym was not tried. For a wrong verdict of taste is no crime known to the law. But the commissioner's report went where such reports go, and the story ran through the drawing rooms as such stories run, that the first arbiter of taste in England had pronounced dead, upon a 2-day visit and a scented handkerchief, a manufactory that then made before the regent's own commissioner a blue no man in Europe could match, and a reputation for infallible taste. Once it has been shown infallibly wrong before a king's household, is a house built on sand, and Mr. Pym found within a 12-month that his pronouncements no longer emptied a shop or filled one, and he removed himself by degrees to the milder judging of watercolors in a spa town, where the stakes were lower and the memories shorter. Mr. Silas Cottrell of Burslem was ruined by inches and lawyers, his advance recovered, his dealings sifted, and the trade, which forgives sharpness but never forgives being made to look a knave and a fool together, closed against him within 2 years. And Mr. Ezra Threlfall's books, rendered to the lawyer on the Friday as ordered, were found to be perfect, which surprised nobody, and to disagree with the work's own bankers in the matter of some £1,900 across 5 years, which surprised the lawyer not at all, and Threlfall stood his trial at the assizes, not for the murdered firings, which no jury could be made to see through, but for the plainer, older felony in the accounts, and was convicted and transported for 14 years. And the last that Aldermere ever certainly heard of him, he was keeping the store's book of a commissary at the far side of the world, in a coat too good for the work, under a sun he had not planned for. And now I must tell you the end you have been waiting for, and I will tell it the way it happened, which was not at a ball, for they were neither of them ball people, but in the works, in the spring, in the little painting room under the north light where her father had taught her. On the morning the first pieces of the regent's own service came white and perfect off the biscuit kiln to be painted. The Duke had taken to coming to the works now, not as an owner walks through a thing he owns, but as a pupil, and he had learned across that winter and spring more of clay and color and fire than his father had learned in a lifetime of loving it, and when the first biscuit of the royal service was set out to be painted, he came and stood at her shoulder in the north light, and he did not make a speech either. He said, "I have spent this winter learning your father's trade, and the first law of it, you tell me, is that the outside of a thing is not evidence, and that a man who wants the truth of what a thing is must put it to the one honest test and read what the fire brings out, whatever it costs him to look. The right test, I am told, is a plain question, honestly asked. Will you marry me?" And Honora Vale, 25, a master colorist's daughter with the stain of 100 blues worn into the skin of her right hand, stood in the room where she had learned everything she was, and did the thing she had promised herself she would do if this ever came, which was to name the cost out loud before she answered, so that he should never think she had not counted it. "There are people in this county," she said, "who spent the winter saying I was mad. And there will be people who spend 20 years saying I was cunning." That the paintress fired her way out of the flower room and into a duchess's chair. That the secret and the little kiln and the royal warrant itself were a long, shrewd courtship, dressed up as a rescue, and they will say it of my father's honest name as well as of mine, and the higher you lift me, the louder they will say it. And the Duke of Aldermere said, "I sat up 3 nights beside my own kiln this winter, and drew the truth of this matter out of the fire with my own hands, and I have given up forever taking the county's word for the inside of anything. Let them judge us however they please. Their taste is bought, and their verdicts are lies, and I have seen the blue come true out of the fire. Marry me, and we will let the work outlast the talk, which is what good work is for." They were married at Aldermere in the June of that year, and Dr. Emery Wexcombe came up from London in his best black to give the bride away, saying he stood where her father would have stood, and counted it the honor of his old age. And old Ned Fairclough, 42 years a fireman, stood godfather within the year to a son. And the new Duchess of Aldermere asked for 3 things at her own wedding feast, and not one of them was for herself. She asked that Ned Fairclough's wage be doubled, and his cottage made freehold to him and his line, because 42 years of faithfulness had been worth precisely nothing against one bought verdict, and that ought to be remembered on that ground forever. She asked that a plain rule be written into the standing orders of the works and kept by every superintendent after, that no judgment upon the works, no color, no body, no firing, and no man should ever again be accepted upon authority alone, however fashionable, however stamped, without one honest test made in the work's own fire. And that rule is in the order book of Aldermere still, and they call it the Duchess's Rule, and superintendents have been heard to sigh over it, which is exactly what it is for. And she asked, last, and her voice was not quite steady upon it, that the very first covered cup of the Regent's completed service, the one true piece to go to Carlton House, be marked underneath, in the small blue letters her father had used, not with the maker's name the trade expected, but with the plain words after Josiah Vale, so that upon a king's own table there should stand a cup that bore witness that a color man of the flint dust and the north light, dead and half forgotten, had taught his daughter to read the inside of things, and that the reading had saved an art, and a fortune, and a house. It was done as she asked. The cup went down to London, with the words cut small and blue beneath the foot, and the great service of Aldermere was 30 years upon the tables of the Regent and the king he became, and the blue of it never faded. And men who know porcelain will tell you that a blue like that is not made now, and they are not wrong. So I keep thinking about that first morning in the counting room, the warm fire, the scented gentleman in the plum-colored coat smiling his soft smile, and a young woman standing in the middle of the floor with a teacup wrapped in a handkerchief and the whole living secret of a lost art in her head, being asked what a paintress could know of glazes by a man 3 weeks from selling the finest. Porcelain works in England for the price of its bricks upon a hired verdict, because that is where it ends for nearly everybody, isn't it? The room agrees, the expert smiles, the door shuts, and the person carrying the truth walks back out across the wet yard alone. It did not end there this time for one reason only. She went back to the fire and made the proof. Quietly, in the cold, cup by cup, until the day it came out of the kiln so true that no man's taste and no man's verdict could call it dead without calling the sun dark. So tell me which one you would have been. In that counting room or in that glazing house? The one who speaks up while the warm room is still smiling? Or the one who keeps the fire until the proof can stand on its own legs in front of men who would rather it fell down? Both of them are in this story, and they are the same woman, and only one of them was ever thanked. Next time I will tell you about a duke's grandmother who advertised for a plain, sensible companion and struck out every accomplished name upon the list, and about the quiet young woman she chose instead, who saw on her very first evening that the great clock on the stair had been stopped for 30 years at 7 minutes past 4, and who asked the one question about it that the whole family had sworn never to answer, and I would dearly love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight. So leave the name of your town in the comments below, and I will read them out. A glazing house in the January frost. A kiln broken open, and a covered cup lifted out of the straw the deep blue of a summer midnight, singing under the thumb. A duke with his sleeve turned back, and the proof in his own 2 hands. And at the edge of the company a young woman in a gray gown, saying nothing at all, while the last of the fire ticks and cools in the great dark kiln behind them like a heart that has finally been believed.